Well, hello. We're ready to begin. This is Al Hernandez-Santana. I'm new to NCUIH, and I work for the policy department. So I work with Julia Dreyer and Sonny Stevenson. Sonny being the Director of Federal Relations and Julia being the VP of Public Policy. I am based in California and just started maybe less than 3 months ago. So I'm really excited, and I'm sorry that I can't see you here face to face, but nevertheless, I'm glad that I'm here to see you virtually at least. And you can call me Al Santana. I dropped the Hernandez a long time ago because it was causing confusion in the state capitol with someone else that had my same name. So with that, please let's go to the first slide. So these are some of the goals that, or the 3 goals that we will be tackling today. And of course, the main prize and the main objective that we want is to really increase your capacity to be able to engage in this sort of work. Because as you will see through my presentation and also dovetailing with some of the examples and accomplishments that Meredith mentioned, you will see that, when you enact a statute, that's not the end of it. There is a whole lot of work that sometimes agencies have to go through in order to make law a reality, to implement it or to further clarify certain things that it may not be clear and things of that nature. And of course, let me make sure I lost my place. So those are some, and you could have, there are law firms that dedicate themselves to just doing straight regulatory work. So you can imagine how much is involved in this process. And not only, one of the main points also to take away, while still saying on the slide, is that there are many ways that you all can collaborate with one another when trying to submit comments on your own or comments together. There are several ways you can do this, but you can always, no matter which way you go, lean on one another for information, for data, for best arguments. Let's say that there's a really strong argument that you think is going to win the day. So you want to have as many people as possible, as many entities and UIOs and other allies submitting comments with the same argument. So that sort of turns then into sort of a coalition work that we would like to see NCUIH, build up and grow into. And so lastly, it's not only about arguments and data, but even the understanding, your own understanding of what the agency is really trying to look into. What are they after? Were there any tension points when the legislation was enacted that they just pawn off and then letting the agency in its discretion decide how to handle it? All those background issues are very important to keep in mind. And for that sort of background, of course, it's ideal that you rely on people like me and Sonny, Meredith, and Julia. But you need to have at least a common understanding, and that's what we are trying to accomplish here today. Next slide, please. So as I began to say, there are, I want you to have regulations in the right context or perspective, meaning that there are 2 ways in which you can get a law passed, right? You can either allow Congress or a state legislature to do it, and that's what you call a statute. You can find those in a library, in a law library, anywhere. But we also have case law, just to give you the full spectrum, which is law based on court decisions, right? And what the federal courts or the state courts decide on a particular matter or interpret a particular piece of legislation. And then finally, we have regulations, which is the, I don't want to call it the gold standard, but like I said, it's the most often used way of promulgating policy, because as you see from the slide, it has the force of law. Once an agency decides to issue a regulation and they take comments and they resolve the comments They go through executive review, and you'll see that process in the next few slides, and then issues a final rule that has the weight of law. So if a health clinic or even a public agency does not follow the regulation, they can be sued in court, or they can have enforcement actions by the Attorney General, by whoever the regulator is of that agency, and you can end up paying penalties or being closed down because you didn't follow the rules and regulations. And lastly, we use those two interchangeably, rule or regulation. And I don't know how the knowledge base of people on the call or the webinar, so I'm just going to assume the most basic, and you can ask me follow-up questions later. But this is a good quote that I think at the bottom helps you frame how to think about regulations. There would be no way to enforce the law if we didn't have those. Next slide, please. So where do they get the authority? Of course, from the statute, and they call it enacting statute. It could be also called enabling statute, and this process is known as rulemaking, which again is now a professional parlance term of art. It makes you sound smart when you say it. Has this gone through rulemaking? Or I think we need to engage in the rulemaking advocacy. So you can take that as you like. But once you say that word, everybody else should know what you're talking about. Next slide, please. So one thing to keep in mind is that it is not always required for the agency to seek public comment or input before proposing a rule. I mean, sometimes the issue is so straightforward, or they have so much discretion in the enabling legislation, or there is, for example, let's say there might be wide consensus in the community as to what needs to happen, that they've simply just put it out without seeking further comments. And you can do that in several ways. These are the most common: a request for information, or RFI. And then when you're thinking of proposing a rule, you can issue an advance notice that basically says, hey, we're thinking about changing this policy at CMS or at the Indian Health Service. But before we put out a formal request for comment, let me tell you what we're thinking about and why we think a change needs to be made. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go through three. It will be helpful, I think, to think about it in terms of 3 steps. I mean, there's obviously more, and it gets complicated the more, or complex, the more you know about regulations and this issue. But it's helpful to think about it in 3 ways. So the step 1 is when the agency itself, of course, is researching an issue. There's a problem that has arisen, or a confusion. Maybe they're getting a lot of inquiries from, let's say, from clinics or from different state agencies saying, hey, this issue, let's say vaccines, it's not clear who's going to pay whom, and when. So we might need the regulation to address that once the pandemic it's over with. So that's known as a Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, or NPRM. And most importantly, this is always published, always in the Federal Register. And I hope that some of you have seen one. It's a little thin, or could be very thick, pamphlet in government paper that has a listing of all the notices put on by the different agencies. And we're going to go through, think of all the agencies in the federal government, okay? From Department of Veterans to Department of Housing, to Health and Human Services, to Department of Interior, and so on. So all of that is consolidated in the Federal Register, and you become adept at reading it and finding stuff in it. So next slide, please. So again, just to give you, I'm going to try to give you the general rule and then touch upon the exceptions to the rule without going too much into that, given that this is the first training of the year. But in short, once the comments are received, okay, and there's a period for submitting comments, then the proposed regulation is issued, and the agency is supposed to revise it accordingly. Now, the slide, takes a shortcut, because in doing so, the agency has a certain number of criteria or standards that they must follow in order to make sure that their decision passes the test of law. Because whatever they decide can't be capricious, right? It can be arbitrary. They have to show in their reasoning that they took account about the comments that were submitted, if they were relevant. If they're not, why not? Or why they decided to discount a certain line of argument or a certain evidence. So all of that is in the reasoning of the agency when they submit the final rule. So then that is published in the Federal Register once they get to that step, and in the official docket of that agency. So when you see regulations.gov, that's not a typo. You don't even need to type www. If you do, it's okay. It's going to take you directly there. Just wanted to point that out in case there's any questions about that. Next slide, please. So this one is pretty busy slide, and let me try to unpack it for you. So the process works like this. We already went through the scenario where, people complained, or the agency itself saw a problem. They put out a notice of proposed rulemaking. Then they request comments from the public. They're submitted. The agency makes a decision, right? Once the decision is made and it's all approved and blessed by the executive branch of the agency, it's going to again be printed in the Federal Register, and it needs to be there for no less than 30 days before it becomes effective. Now, this is a general rule. Like I said, I keep saying that. It could be sooner if it's, but the agency has to show good cause why they had to deal with an emergency, or it's doesn't serve the purposes of the public if they were to delay implementation of the rule. And then the way the slide describes it, it seems like it's sequential. This business of preparing it to be codified. Okay, that's another term of art. It is codified into the Code of Federal Regulation. I want to make clear to you that you don't have to wait the 30 days for that whole rule to be codified. On the same day that the final rule is published, for example, the government printing office and the staff at the Federal Register begin to work together immediately to integrate it into the code. And so there's this electronic Code of Federal Regulations that everybody has access to. That's why I explained in the bottom of the slide, from a legal professional to anybody really who's interested. And there are like 50 subject matter titles. So you can quickly become, you tend to go to like 3 or 4 or no more than 5 areas to really become familiar with, be able to recognize the nomenclature, the numbers from that the agency uses, for example, for their different designated Federal Register notices. And as I indicated earlier, it becomes really a heavy workload. And that's one of the reasons why, NCUIH opened this position for me to come in, is to help in that process. So let me not say more about that right now. You will see that I refer to, again, to the .gov website that you can go to, and you can just type it like that. Again, you don't even need to, type HTTP or www. There was one more thing I wanted to say about that before I leave the slide, which is that the electronic copy is not the, what do you call that? You can't take that to the bank, because the ultimate official document is the Federal Register. So there are 2 things about that. let's say you're in that 30-day waiting period. It doesn't matter that the CFR has not published it yet. If the register, it already did, and there's been 30 days, you're going to be subjected to that rule or regulation. So that's important to keep in mind. And then if you ever go into that database, make sure that you go to the homepage and see as of what date the CFR is updated to, because they do it every month, every quarter at least. And so you need to, make sure that you're tracking when your issue was heard and whether it made it to the CFR and then you're reading the right version of it, okay? All right, next slide, please. And since this is my first time presenting, so anybody help me from NCUIH if I'm taking too long, too much time. But here I just wanted to illustrate for you, and some of these slides I borrowed from Sonny, so it pays off to to have that history in the institution. But this is what it looks like, and you'll see that it's got a publication date, the agency that is supposed to be taking action, and what kind of action it is. This is a request for information, and you see document type, and everything that you need to do to find it. When you look at the bottom before page, it's got a page number, but document citation is also very key to be able to type that in the database, and it will pop right up. Okay, next slide, please. So it always has a background section. And again, this helps orient you as to the need for regulation or the conflict that it's trying to address. And in Indian health law, of course, we have the additional historical background that's, sometimes is very helpful to understand and know and apply in your comments even when you have the opportunity. Next slide, please. So this is the part when they actually tell you that they are soliciting public comment. And they, of course, they'll have all their, you call those, not exceptions, but for example, when it says this RFI is not intended, disclaimers, that's the word I was thinking about, not intended to inform policy, which will preempt state law. So they have to be clear as to the scope of the regulation and what it can or cannot do. And then they will list questions for you, as you can see, sometimes, not always. Next slide, please. So then to review, let me make sure I get back to my notes for a second. Reviewing this before a rule is published or promulgated, that's the way you normally talk about it, a regulation being promulgated. You need to first have a statute, okay? Sometimes you'll have a request for information or advance notice. Other times not, it just goes straight to a notice of rulemaking. The draft is published in the Federal Register with the request for comment. And in a way, they always tell you, okay, if you want to submit comments, this is the way you should do it. Culminating in the final rule, or what we call sometimes interim final rule. Again, remember how I was talking about the agency does not always need to seek public comment necessarily. So if they do not, they usually will issue an interim final rule in case people have, they have later objections, or they say you didn't think about this factor or the other factor, or in the case that the agency feels that it has not really gotten all the evidence. We were talking about this earlier today at staff meeting about the analyzers versus the doers. So let's say that the agency says, we need one more year of data. Let's say we're implementing the Affordable Care Act, right? And they want to know, okay, so how many uninsured, are now insured and under what plans? So before we issue a mandate, we want to know that information. So the agency could say, let's do an interim final rule, and then we'll issue, we'll take comments again through the year and then issue the final rule. I hope that was clear, but I can circle back to that if there's questions. So once it goes through the review, it is published for 30 days as a general rule, and then it gets codified into the CFR. And you can't just rest on your laurels and wait for the CFR to show it. You have to, that's the first thing that you can always cover your back, is to make sure you're always dealing with the Federal Register. Thank you. Next slide. So remember I was talking about, following a number of agencies, and these are some of the key agencies that we deal with on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis, right? And they are all familiar to you, I'm sure. But you see how each one has their nomenclature and so forth and so on. When you get into these databases, you become pretty quickly, you become familiar with all the acronyms and how to track a particular piece of promulgation or regulation. Next slide, please. So this is important because not only can the agency, in its wisdom, decide we better get public comment before we make a change to policy, you as an individual, normally as an association or a group of private entities, can petition HHS or the Indian Health Service or the Veterans Affairs. You can petition for rulemaking, and then the agency can decide, that sounds like a good idea. Let's go ahead and put out a request for comment, or even they can take a further step and start the whole process. Advance notice, right, of proposed rulemaking, then propose rulemaking and seeking comment, culminating in a final rule. Next slide, please. I think we're doing good on time. So this is where you can find them. Again, regulations.gov will be your go-to resource. And then you can subscribe. I would recommend that if you're starting this work, let's say, the first thing you should do so that it doesn't become overwhelming is to subscribe to the agency's website, because they will always tell you, hey, recently we filed in the Federal Register the following notice, so at least you'll have that number, and then you can go and look for it. So same thing with other websites, like the Federal Register itself. And then also rely on other organizations that are doing the same work. Rely on NCUIH when we put something out, and then develop your own contacts, right, as you get through this work. And obviously, you know a lot about Dear Tribal Leader letters, or the DOLS, the Urban Indian Organization letters, and so on. So those are all important sources of information that can inform your work and make you think, is there that could be done about this, short of trying to change the law right now? Okay, next slide. So the takeaway from the next few slides is the matter that in Indian country and Indian health law in general, we have sort of like a second layer, if you will, of regulatory processes, because we have a mandated requirement for tribal consultation and for urban confer for the urbans, right? And as Meredith mentioned, right now that policy is only required of the Indian Health Service, but we're saying other agencies should follow the same, right? So that's one thing that we have on our plate. But just to give you the notion that if you're doing this work, you could be submitting comments. Most of the time, let's say 80, 90% or more of the time, you're going to be submitting comments to the Indian Health Service or to CMS, but not necessarily. You may end up submitting comments of more broader application. Again, it could be HHS dealing with the health reform, or in the case of NCUIH, Sonny brought up an issue with the Federal Communications Commission that is affecting, low-income urban Indians. So just keeping that in mind, how interesting it is that we have two sort of intermingled aspects to this that becomes the work. It makes the work a little bit more challenging, if you will, or at least complex. Next slide, and I think I'm getting to the end of my presentation. Again, this is just refers to the different authorization statutes that talk about how urban confer is supposed to be conducted and under what authority, what are the responsibilities, how does the agency hold itself accountable, and how you can hold the agency accountable in the same breath. And so you see that the phrase, the term phrase, it's in bold there when it says, whenever a critical event or issue, okay, as defined in the policy arises, that triggers the urban confer, okay? And there's always a question, you know, in people's minds, but you have to always go back to that language and be able to articulate it and defend it. Next slide, please. This is mostly just about the mechanics. Again, the fact that a critical event or issue may be identified by you, okay, or a group of you, or a consortia, you know, of clinics, a regional area, so forth. And then if you do, the Indian Health Service, for instance, has to respond within 60 days. So that is a very clear and effective tool that you can use, because you need to, they're going to have to tell you where they stand. You know, it's not a phone conversation. It's not rumor. It's like, okay, what is your answer? I need an answer. And then urban confer, again, similar, typical use of webinars. They use listening sessions. They can always take, they can always take comments verbally, okay, when they do one of these sessions, and they will tell you if it's being recorded. Most folks, you know, and by that including us, are not comfortable enough to only rely on verbal, you know, oral comments. They say, okay, this is my comments, and they might read it, but I'm also going to submit it to you in writing. But one thing that I want to make sure that you guys keep in mind is the following. This process is supposed to be a democratic one, right? So even if they have all of this technical rules of, you know, you got to submit it to this inbox using, you know, using email, using the following or that address, you could have any American Indian that wants to speak on the issue, and you can bring him with you to the session, right? Virtual session. And if they don't have the wherewithal to put something in writing, that's okay. You are there to sort of coach them through it, just like if they were doing congressional testimony, right? And then you make it clear, you make it absolutely clear that if you're not going to submit them in writing, that they know this is the only chance they're going to get to consider the comments. So they better take a good job at taking notes and going back to the video, you know, the audio recording. That would be just, you know, a little tip for you. Next slide, please. So this is what the call for comments would look like. You get these normally in an email. It could be directed straight to you, or it could be part of a website or a listserv that you are subscribed to. So they always tell you, please put the following in the subject line, address the comments to this, you know, official or that official, and then how to actually go into a conference if there will be a virtual meeting about it. I don't think there should be any questions about that. I think I'm coming to the end. You want to go to the next slide and see where we are? Okay, so this wraps up some of the best practices, which I started to talk about here and there, but more so towards the end. You know, whenever you submit comments to an agency, and Sonny is, of course, you know, very good at this, is you have to say why it matters to you. And also, just as important, why they should listen to you. You know, do you have expertise in the area? How long have you had this problem? Were you involved in the history of the issue? Let's say that the agency changed policy midstream in the 1970s, and then a program totally was abandoned, right? How was it? How was reality before before that program got defunded? You know, what were you able to do back then? that you're not able to do today. So those are things that are always useful for the agency to consider. And again, keep it simple, highlighting the main points, include the authority. And again, this is another area where you can rely on us, either on template letters or just picking up the phone or an email and asking, hey, what is the authority? How can I frame this so that they know, I know what I'm talking about, first of all, but also that they have to follow certain guidelines. Sometimes, and this is the last thing I will say, sort of, I'm rambling off the mouth here. The agency may be a little confused, let's say, right, to put it mildly, as to what requirements in statute they're governed by. They might say, oh, we have to give weight to an executive order, or we have to give weight to this statute because it was passed in 1982. And you can say, well, no, the statute from 1976 is still in effect and you're ignoring it. So that's just one example. Keep it professional and then keep them relevant. That's all I'll say there. I'm not sure, this is an older slide, so I'm not sure what the point was about unsolicited letters. But if Sonia's still on the line, she can maybe chime in on that. But let me wrap up, go to the final slide, and then take questions from you. And how are we doing on time? Cebu, do you know?
We're a little over, but I think if there's any questions that anyone has for Al on his informative and very helpful presentation, the mic is all yours if there's anything that you have any questions. And in the meantime, we have post evaluation surveys just to get your feedback on today's, on Al's training and how it was helpful. So please make sure to do that. In addition, I included a SurveyMonkey link for those who want to just see what other topics you would like to have in the future for policy and what other and how we could improve future trainings and webinars. So really appreciate all your support, and we couldn't do this without you. So thank you all.
Thank you so much for being interested in this issue. And again, I tend to move around a little bit, given my culture. I use my hands, so I hope that was not too distracting. I got two monitors over here, also going at the same time. But thank you for your time, and I hope you did get something out of it.
And if there is not anything else, we will be sending. This will be provided in an email. This presentation with a follow-up survey, and keep a lookout for civic engagement webinar that's coming up in sometime in March. But we'll be sending it out for everyone. And thank you. Thanks for IHS in partnership with NCUIH to make this webinar happen, and the National Urban Indian Family Coalition. So